Well, thank you very much, Jemmy. I'm speechless. That doesn't happen often either. Really and truly, I'm quite stunned. And I'm so happy to be here again, 12 years later. I hope I'm still here when you're in your at least 20th year, maybe 25th year. And this time I get to stay till tomorrow night as well to see your performance, Glynis, and attend the Cherry Bomb Cabaret, for which I searched for a week and found the proper lipstick called Cherry Bomb, which I'll be wearing tomorrow night. So let me begin formally then by saying that I am very honored to have been invited to give the keynote address at the Annual Performance Art Symposium here at the Owens Art Gallery. There seems to be a touch of irony here, however, because the topic that I will be speaking about is not about performance at all. When Jemmy approached me this summer with the invitation to give this lecture, I regretfully told her that my current research projects have shifted away from performance, and Jemmy just gave something of a description of where I've been going with things. I thought that she would just give me a polite thanks anyway, and that would be the end of it. But those of you who know Jemmy know that she is neither narrow in her thinking, nor is she easily discouraged. So I explained that the focus of my research now has turned to the history of conceptual art in Canada, and that one body of material that was sufficiently well developed for a public lecture had to do with the role of conceptual art in relationship to lithography at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. Jemmy thought this topic would be interesting in itself. I gather there's some significant activity here in the relationship to printmaking. But she also supported my suggestion that I would preface my lecture with a short explanation of how and why my research has moved from performance to conceptual art, and what the links in the chain were that connected these two seemingly disparate areas of interest. I like that idea, and so here we are this evening. For me, the main link in the chain between performance and conceptual art is feminist thought and practice. Back in the 1990s, I was working on my doctoral dissertation on the relationship between the simultaneous emergence of feminist art and performance art in the 1970s as artistic categories in their own rights. The main argument of my thesis was that feminist art, and feminist performance in particular, made a major contribution to the history of contemporary art in two main ways. Firstly, it exposed the ways in which art is always political, even when this truth was obscured by the depoliticized aestheticism that prevailed in the art world right through to the end of the 1960s. And secondly, it insisted that art must reclaim its social significance by negotiating a new relationship between art and politics. While working on my dissertation, however, I attended a conference at which one of the presenters claimed that it was conceptual art that had brought about the transformation in the art world that I had attributed to feminist art and performance. The gist of that argument was that conceptual art had exposed and challenged the ways in which modernist art and criticism were confined to aesthetic problems and judgments. By shifting the emphasis to a demand for intellectual rather than perceptual understanding, conceptual art brought about a radical critique of the art world itself, most especially of its systems of display, reception, and commodification. While I concurred with the basic premise of this claim, I also thought it ignored a crucial difference between conceptual art and feminist art. For although conceptual art enacted a critique of the art world's systems and even of its politics, it did so within the insularity of the art world itself. By contrast, feminist art, especially in its performative aspect, was linked to a broad-based political movement that was making demands for social change both within and beyond the art world. In other words, because feminist art is defined first and foremost by its socio-political intent and affiliations, its objectives have never been confined to what we might call intramural debates within the art world. On this basis, as I argued in my book, Radical Gestures, feminist performance can be seen as the singularly most important factor in reawakening contemporary art to the historical avant-garde ideal of what Peter Berger called the reorganization of the praxis of life through art, which essentially means changing the conditions of life itself. By the time my book was finally published, I was definitely ready for a new challenge. In the interim years, a profusion of publications on conceptual art had emerged, the overall goal of which was to redress the situation that, as one author described it, conceptual art had received a lack of serious discussion by art historians and critics over the last 2 decades that was incommensurate with the tremendous influence it has had on subsequent artistic developments, critical discussions of postmodernism, and art theory in general. I was both provoked and intrigued on numerous levels by the content, premises, and gaps in this spate of publications. But my decision to redirect my new research to conceptual art was motivated by 3 main concerns. First, I wanted to test my own claims about the radical impact of feminist art and performance against similar claims being made for conceptual art. Second, although I acknowledge the radical critical significance of conceptualism on the past 30 or so years of contemporary art practice, I also wanted to submit the claims being made by its new apologists to a more skeptical and self-critical analysis of what I saw as the often overblown and overstated assertions. Third, although one of the key facets of these assertions was that conceptualist practices destroyed the hegemony of the then dominant art world centers like New York by enabling a new form of global participation, virtually all these publications were either silent upon or incorrect about any role that Canada might have played in this new reorientation. In light of all this, I determined that there was more than ample reason to begin my new research close to home, a premise that led me directly into the unexpected aesthetic complexity and seemingly obscure cultural and political significance of the NSCAD lithography workshop. And that will be the focus of the rest of my talk. This workshop came about during the transformation the college underwent following the hiring of Gary Neal Kennedy as president in 1967, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that history. Kennedy, who had just received his MFA from Ohio University in 1965, immediately began to overhaul the school and its curriculum. He sacked several long-standing faculty members and hired some new ones, like himself, who were conversant with the most current trends in art practice at the time. These changes alienated many in the local art community, especially because all but one of the newcomers were outsiders, namely British designers and American artists who were proponents of new and little understood ideas about art. Although this importation of non-Canadians was sharply criticized as a sign of cultural imperialism, notably by the strongly nationalistic Canadian artist Greg Curnow, Kennedy had in fact tried to hire several prominent Canadians, including Curnow himself and the Vancouver artist Ian Baxter, but they were unable or unwilling to come to what at the time seemed like a complete backwater. After all, Halifax was virtually nowhere. By contrast, many of the Americans invited by Kennedy saw the opportunity to come to NSCAD as a way to leave behind the turmoil then afflicting American society. By 1968, the euphoria of the countercultural revolution had imploded under the weight of the international crises that took place that year from Paris to Prague to Mexico City. In the United States, it was a year of unrelenting catastrophe and mayhem, including the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, the student occupation of Columbia University in New York, and the rioting that took place in cities across the country after the assassination of Martin Luther King. With the election of Richard Nixon in November of 1969 and the invasion of Cambodia in early 1970, the escalation of the war in Vietnam seemed certain. The resulting implementation of a draft lottery for 18-year-olds and the reduction of deferments for university students, because prior to that, if they had been attending university, they were essentially protected from being drafted. There's a whole class-based issue there. But the reduction of deferments for university students led to a surge of middle-class draft dodgers, or resistors, if you like, into Canada. Although few of the teachers and students who came to NSCAD during these years were actual draft resistors, the allure of Canada as a haven for free thinkers was compelling. This allure was a major factor behind the success of two of NSCAD's most innovative programs during this period, the Visiting Artist Program and the Lithography Workshop. Together, these two programs brought a steady stream of international artists to Halifax, most of whom were emerging conceptual or performance artists. The effect was to catapult this small regional school, which had never even really come to terms with modern art, into a sudden encounter with the most radical forms of art practice being made anywhere in the world at that time. These programs worked in tandem because one of the main purposes of the lithography workshop was to offer visiting artists the opportunity to produce a limited edition print with the assistance of a master printer. The Litho Workshop was initially run under the direction of Jack Lemon, and the master printer was Bob Rogers, both of whom had been affiliated with the Kansas City Art Institute and the Tamarind Lithography Workshop in Los Angeles. During its first year, the NSCAD Litho Workshop operated largely in accordance with Tamarind's original ideals and objectives. When Tamarind was founded in 1960 under the direction of a woman named June Wayne, not John Wayne, June Wayne, its main intention was, quote, to rescue the art of the lithograph, end quote. Wayne's motivation had been to redress the practices then prevalent in European printmaking, whereby the artist would simply supply a sketch or painting to a master printer who would copy or interpret this onto the stone. This so-called interpretation would be mechanically reproduced by means of photolithography and then sold as signed originals. By contrast, the Tamarind method was to have the artist come to the print shop for an extended period of time and work directly with the master printer so as, again in June Wayne's words, so as to accustom artists and printers to intimate collaboration so that each becomes responsive to the other, end quote, thus elevating the overall aesthetic quality of the finished print. As Eric Cameron has noted in an essay he's written on the Litho Workshop, this Tamarind ideal led to the production of a series of spectacular technical achievements during the first year of the NSCAD Litho Workshop. And now I'm going to, okay, so, this is by remote, I gather.
Yeah, it's just that this is stuck on us.
Oh. There we go. Right. So Cameron was saying that the first year at the NSCAD Litho Workshop resulted in these spectacular technical achievements. And these included a print by Toronto artist Gordon Rayner, which you see over there on the left, a work called Untitled from 1969, involving the application of 12 colors in 15 bands at a different angle on each of 4 plates. And one by Washington artist Gene Davis on the right, with the unprecedented number of 22 colors. Another of these complex early projects was even made by Greg Curnow. There we go. And these are two views of the work by Greg Curnow. The one on the left is the first in the series, and then the one on the right is one of the images from a series of 10 that are meant to look like this writing pad. So this is further down in the one on the right is meant to illustrate something that's further down in the writing pad. So one of these projects was even by Greg Curnow, who, even though he had sharply criticized NSCAD as an outpost of American art, agreed to come to Halifax in February of 1970 and produced a highly innovative suite of these 10 lithographs, which imitated a writing pad with typed notes recounting his visit to Halifax. And the title of the work is homage to Sam Langford, who is a boxer. During 1970, however, the NSCAD Litho workshop turned in a different direction. A major factor was Gerald Ferguson's assumption of the directorship that year, with the explicit intention of bringing in more international artists in order to gain access to the more lucrative American art market. A second factor was the strong orientation NSCAD took at this time towards conceptual art, a shift that had a discernible effect on the kinds of artists who began coming to NSCAD. In 1970, conceptual art was still a new mode of practice, having only just been identified as such in 1967 in Saul LeWitt's influential essay called Paragraphs on Conceptual Art. And in that essay, he described conceptual art as an art form in which the concept or idea is the most important thing. The centrality of conceptual art at NSCAD had been confirmed in 1969 when the college hosted the Halifax Conference. This conference was dreamed up by Ferguson and Lawrence Weiner and quickly gained promotional support from Seth Siegelaub. It's often thought that Seth Siegelaub had initiated the conference, but in fact it was Ferguson and Lawrence Weiner. Seth Siegelaub quickly came on board and was very enthusiastic about it. He was a dealer and an impresario, New York dealer and impresario of conceptual art at the time. For Siegelaub, the conference was an ideal example of how what he called the informational aspect of conceptual art could lead to the kind of geographic decentralization that had been famously prophesied in 1964 by Marshall McLuhan's theory of the global village. All in all, the Halifax Conference, attended by 25 artists from 7 countries for an intensive 2-day exchange and debate of ideas, was a pivotal moment for NSCAD. It established conceptualism as the basis of practice there, and it really put the college on the map internationally, thus making it much easier to attract artists to visit and participate in the litho workshop. The impact of these changes was immediately evident in the litho workshop, which turned decisively away from the values promoted by the Tamarind Renaissance, and as Cameron said, at times even seemed to travesty them. Because conceptual artists were dedicated to the radical questioning of all prevailing modes of art production, reception, and commodification, the paradoxical situation arose whereby conceptual artists making prints at NSCAD were endeavoring to achieve these goals both by means of and through the subversion of the preeminently traditional, labor-intensive, commercially oriented, and artisan-based medium of lithography. The results, which were perhaps less technically spectacular than the lithographs produced during the first year, were engaged directly with then current aesthetic and cultural debates, and thus demonstrated the unique way in which printmaking could become a vehicle for and material articulation of these debates. One of the first prints to register this new direction was done in 1970 by Ian Baxter. And this is Baxter's print on the left. And Ian Baxter may also be known to you as one of the 2 founders and members of the organization called Anything Company. At the time, it consisted of Ian Baxter and his wife Ingrid. A connection between Anything Company and NSCAD had been established a year earlier by way of a series of long-distance exchanges of information and propositions that were carried out via telex, telecopier, and telephone, the results of which were then exhibited at NSCAD's Annalee and Owens Gallery and published as a book. Such strategies for making art were fully commensurate with conceptual art's abandonment of traditional discipline-based approaches to art making in favor of new modes of communication and information dissemination. These strategies were particularly useful in Canada, a country with small art communities spread out over a vast geography, because they provided a way for artists to emerge from regional isolation and connect with one another and with international artists in that much vaunted community spirit of the global village. Indeed, it was the vitality of its decentralized art scene, as exemplified in this exchange between Vancouver and Halifax, that led American art critic Lucy Lepard to cite Canada in particular as a place that she described as, quote, more fertile for new ideas and new ways of disseminating art than the US. Baxter's NSCAD print incorporated another project from 1969, namely his own cover design for the May-June issue of Art in America. So that's what you're seeing on this, in the slide on the left. This cover reproduced 16 slide photographs that themselves documented previous works by Anything Company. These were mostly images of landscapes and urban or industrial sites that had been transformed into art through Anything's process of declaration that they called ACT, which stood for Aesthetically Claimed Things. For the NSCAD lithograph, Baxter carried this sequence of transformations back onto itself in a characteristically conceptual procedure of self-reflexiveness, as indicated by the title of this photograph, which is P plus L plus P plus L plus P equals VSI, where P stands for photograph, L for lithograph, and VSI for visual sensitivity information. What began in a photographic format, that is the slides, became an offset lithograph for Art in America, which was in turn photographed for printing on a metal lithographic plate. The final photographic transformation took place after the edition was printed. In what Baxter called a gesture of complete consciousness of the medium, all 50 prints were crumpled, piled on the floor, and then photographed. Those who purchased this work received a flattened out print, as well as a title card and a slide of the pile of crumpled prints. So the object on the right is this sleeve, which contains this title card and this slide, and the slide is a photograph of this pile of crumpled prints. The self-reflexive investigation of the process of printmaking evident in Baxter's print recurs in many of the conceptually oriented prints done in the lithography workshop. For example, Gary Kennedy's 1970 print called Untitled entailed running 10 sheets of paper through the press with increasing pressure an exponential number of times for a total of 512 passes in the case of the 10th sheet of paper, resulting ultimately in a nondescript gray field with a black bar down the center. Gerald Ferguson's Gerald Ferguson's 1973 print, also called Untitled, relied for its process on the length of time required for lithographic prints to dry, lithographic inks to dry. Ferguson made the print by inking a black rectangle on the stone and running it through the press. The rectangle was immediately re-inked, but for the second pass through the press, the paper was adjusted to overlap half the rectangle. The result was a square divided into 3 equal vertical bands of subtle gradations of ink density due to the differences caused by ink on paper, ink on ink, and ink offsetting during the last pass through the press. And unfortunately, the gradations are so subtle that they are virtually invisible in this photograph of the print on the right, and they are barely visible when you look at it with the naked eye, but they are evident. This self-reflexiveness regarding the printmaking process also formed the basis of Robert Ryman's print from 1971 called Two Stones, which is here on the right. This print involved clamping together 2 small stones, rolling the surface in white ink, although the white ink has now, over time, discolored to this kind of pussy yellow effect, but it was originally white on white paper, so it involved rolling these surfaces in white ink and then pulling the impression under such pressure that the edges of the stones were embossed onto the larger sheet of paper to form what could be called a litho relief. By thus presenting the finished print as an imprint of the stones themselves rather than as an image produced by making marks on the surface of the stones, Ryman drew attention simultaneously to the reproducibility of the printmaking medium and to the status of the stone as a vehicle for the artist's autographic marks, which in this case were completely absent. As Eric Cameron observed, this tendency to, in his words, depersonalize the selfhood of the artist is indicative of a crucial aspect of the conceptual basis of printmaking at NSCAD. This repression of artistic subjectivity is evident not only in Ryman's print, but also in those by Baxter, Kennedy, and Ferguson, because the processes and techniques of the printmaking medium supersede the artist's autographic activity. This criticism of subjectivity as the basis of art practice was central to conceptual art. As historian Alex Albero has noted, placing emphasis on the conceptual process was a way to eliminate the perceptual object and thus, in his words, dismantle the myths of integrated subjectivity. The point of this preoccupation with process in these NSCAD prints was emphatically not, therefore, to explore the intrinsic nature of printmaking's materials, techniques, and procedures, as was the case at Tamarind. On the contrary, it was to test the premise, so fundamental to conceptual art, of the primacy of the idea itself. This premise even made it possible for the conceptual artist to jettison the autographic authenticity of the artist altogether. Lawrence Weiner asserted this point emphatically in his 1968 Declaration of Intent. The artist may construct the piece, he says. The piece may be fabricated. The piece need not be built, each being equal and consistent with the intent of the artist. The decision as to condition rests with the receiver upon the occasion of receivership. In other words, not only does the legitimate existence of the work of art not require the artist's autographical or indexical trace, but the work can also be made by someone else other than the artist, or not even be made at all. Although Weiner was a frequent visitor to NSCAD throughout the 70s, even from the late 1960s, he never made a print with the lithography workshop because he refused to sign his work during those years, and the litho workshop would not produce unsigned prints. Under the he's changed that position, by the way. Under the auspices of the workshop, however, Lawrence Weiner did produce a book in 1971 called Flowed. This demonstrates both the non-dogmatic way in which the practice of printmaking was viewed at NSCAD and the stress on the idea over the medium. These principles were affirmed by Gerald Ferguson in his entry for a 1974 International Book on Printmaking Workshops, which stated that lithography at NSCAD was regarded as, and I quote him, an open circumstance with a rich historical tradition, but no more or less valuable than any other medium for the demonstration of an idea by an artist, end quote. Ferguson's statement echoed the key premise laid out in 1967 by Sol LeWitt in his paragraphs on conceptual art, which I previously mentioned. And this is what Sol LeWitt said. In conceptual art, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses a conceptual form in art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand, and the execution is a perfunctory affair. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art. Accordingly, when LeWitt was invited to work with the Litho Workshop in 1971, he proposed a set of 10 prints, of which you see one on the left, a set of 10 prints based on instructions that were sent by mail. The instructions for the first 7 prints were handed over to students who executed them by interpreting LeWitt's ambiguous and open-ended commands, such as, quote, within a 20-inch square, using a black hard crayon, draw 10,000 freehand lines of any length at random. The last 3 prints, which is an example of which is here on the right. The last 3 prints were based on LeWitt's instructions to the master printer, such as, quote, print this in 4 colors, black, red, blue, and yellow, by turning the stone a quarter turn for each color. In each case, the instructions were typeset at the bottom of the print, And very faintly, you can see on the right here and at the bottom in red ink on the print on the left. So these instructions were typeset at the bottom, right on the print. On one level, this inclusion of the written instructions established the basis for comparing the idea machine that generated the work to the results of its perfunctory execution. On another level, it demonstrated one of the characteristics that historian Benjamin Buchloh has identified as central to Lewitt's work. That is, by including both visual information and verbal instruction, his prints create conflict and confusion over whether the viewer-reader should prioritize visual perception or linguistic analysis. By thus refusing to submit to the logic of art as based strictly on the evidence of the visual, Lewitt's NSCAD prints shed light on his seemingly paradoxical statement that, quote, conceptual artists are mystics rather than rationalists. They leap to conclusions that logic cannot reach, end quote. The skepticism implied both by Lewitt's statement and his NSCAD prints about the modernist privileging of visual effects was pervasive in conceptual art and evident in many of the NSCAD lithographs, including the one made by the Californian artist, conceptual artist John Baldessari, which is certainly one of the more well-known prints from the NSCAD litho collection. As with Wiener and Lewitt, Baldessari's work addressed the relationship between the status of art as a mode of visual gratification and as a mode of linguistic denomination. This line of inquiry had its origins in Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades, which had proposed that art was an arbitrary thing, defined not by any inherent aesthetic quality or essence, but rather by the conventionalized procedures of naming certain forms and practices as art. It is significant to note, however, that the proposition of the ready-mades did not rely on the tautological premise that anything can be art simply because the artist says so. On the contrary, propositions about art require the existence of an authoritative institution that holds at least theoretical power to affirm or refute their validity. Thus, when conceptual artists picked up on Duchamp's line of inquiry into the status and conditions of art, they did so by testing their propositions against the authority of an art world still dominated by modernism's prioritizing of visuality and sensual gratification. The frequent result was the production of austere, apparently banal, and sensually depleted linguistic propositions or photographic documentations. Much of this work, such as Lawrence Wiener's 1968 piece called 2 minutes of spray paint directly on the floor from a standard aerosol spray can, simply looked boring. So when Baldessari agreed in 1971 to do an exhibition at the NSCAD Gallery and to make a print with the Litho Workshop, it was precisely this boring condition of conceptual art that he addressed. In a letter to the gallery director, he proposed what he called a punishment piece, which would require student surrogates, as he called them, to cover the gallery walls top to bottom with the handwritten phrase, "I will not make any more boring art." After this directive was duly carried out for the exhibition, Baldessari's own sample text was used for the workshop print. So on one level, Baldessari's statement encapsulates a central problematic of conceptual art. By resisting and refusing the visual emollients that made art pleasurable and consumable, conceptual art aimed to demystify aesthetic experience and mastery, and to propose a more rational and democratizing approach to art making. As historian Fraser Ward has argued, however, the implicit message of conceptual art that, quote, anybody can do that, end quote, and its presentation of relatively flimsy bits and pieces as art often resulted in hostility and alienation from its public audience, who, as Fraser says, needed better persuasion to give up its aesthetic pleasures, end quote. In this respect, Baldessari's print and corresponding student activities in the gallery seem to embody both a form of collective penance and a defiant, ironic refusal of precisely those values that would deem such penance to be justified. On another level, however, Baldassari's letter, which calls in messianic tones for students and artists to atone for their sins through self-flagellation, as he put it, reveals a subtext of mysticism and irrationalism that seems to go against the grain of conceptual art's empirical rationalism, and yet also accords with Lewitt's own characterization of conceptual artists as mystics, not rationalists. In addition to these prints that use process-oriented strategies to undermine the privileging of visual perception and pleasure upon which high modernist art had depended, there were also prints by artists who relied upon the formal constructs and social meanings of photography for similarly critical purposes. Prime examples of such work would include Dan Graham's Homes for America from 1971 and Victor Bergen's Untitled. Can you switch that, Jimmy? Thanks. Victor Bergen's Untitled from 1975. As Jeff Wall, David Campany, and others have shown, photography came to play an intrinsic role in conceptual art precisely because it reintroduced the visual in a form previously considered to lie outside the domain of art. So photography came from anywhere but art. It appealed to conceptual artists both because it was the artless mass medium of commerce, documentation, reporting, and information, and because it was, to quote Campany, it was marked by an indexicality that was diametrically opposed to the modern desire for transcendence and autonomy, end quote. In the case of the prints by Graham and Bergen, this indexicality was explicitly grounded in images that referred to how the industrialized and manufactured conditions of modernity have penetrated even to the seemingly protected core of the private home and domestic life. The use of photography per se in such prints would have been frowned upon at Tamarind, but presented no problem at the NSCAD Litho Workshop, which produced many prints by these means. These prints by Graham and Bergen, however, are set apart both from the overall ethos of conceptual art and from its manifestation in the NSCAD Litho Workshop because their points of reference are not solely directed inwards to art and the systems that define it, but outwards to the larger social world. In other words, the social references in these prints differed from conceptual art's tendency to restrict its discourse to the realm of art itself. Given that the height of conceptual art activities coincided with the period of extreme social turmoil in the late 1960s and early 70s, this tendency became a disappointment for some of conceptualism's strongest advocates. As Seth Siegelau bitterly remarked in 1973, quote, "Conceptual art, more than all previous types of art, questions the fundamental nature of art. Unhappily, the question is strictly limited to the exclusive domain of fine art. There is still potential of it enabling an examination of all that surrounds art, but in reality, conceptual artists are dedicated only to exploring avant-garde aesthetic problems," end quote. Lucy Lepard shared this view and lamented the unwillingness of conceptual artists to focus on anything beyond, quote, "the narrow and incestuous art world," end quote. Such references to larger social conditions were as rare among the NSCAD Litho Workshop prints as they were both within conceptualism and art practice at this time in general. They were conspicuously evident, however, in several prints made by the very small number of women artists invited to participate in the Litho Workshop. For example, in her two prints from 1974 called Homage and Re-Art History, on the right, Californian artist Miriam Shapiro, who is a friend and collaborator of Judy Chicago, addressed the hardly accidental annihilation of women artists from the constructed history of art. By thus drawing attention to the value-based judgments of art and art history, her works differed from the insularity of conceptual art because they alluded to how the art world's assessments of aesthetic value are bound up with social values. In this case, the unspoken but very real hierarchy based along sex-gender lines. The first woman to make a print with the Litho Workshop was in fact Joyce Wieland. In many ways, Her print constituted an even more explicit engagement with the social world and a more radical intervention into the male-dominated conceptual art milieu at NSCAD than had Shapiro's. Wieland made her print in December 1970 when she came to Halifax as a kind of appendage to her more famous husband, Michael Snow. Although Snow was the star attraction at the time, his print, called Projection, which features Snow's image in profile supporting an impressive erection, has subsequently been eclipsed by the significance accorded to Wieland's print, O Canada. So, there we have the historical decision. Wieland's print was fully commensurate with the national... I knew you wanted to look at that, but... Wieland's print was fully commensurate with the nationalistic and feminist themes she had been exploring since 1964. Its explicit patriotism was indicative of the growing sense of national identity in Canada at this time, in the wake of Expo 67, the glamour of Pierre Elliott Trudeau as Prime Minister, and Canada's sense of its difference from and resistance to American culture. Wieland produced O Canada by applying her lipsticked mouth to the litho stone in the formation of the words of the Canadian national anthem. This economy of means was in accordance with the pared-down restrictiveness of conceptual art, but the embodied and erotic connotations of O Canada also ran counter to what historian Benjamin Buchloh has described as conceptual art's denigration of those practices which are, as he says, of performance, of the body, end quote. And given the explicit femininity of these connotations in her print, they most certainly also ran counter to the inherent masculinism of NSCAD's conceptual art coterie. Yet Wieland's O Canada was not the only print at NSCAD to defy the conceptual denigration of performance or of bodily practices. In 1971, Vito Acconci made two prints with the Litho Workshop, Kiss Off and Trademarks. As with most of his work from this period, they were based on performative enactments of textual propositions. Trademarks, which is the one you see illustrated here, consists of two large photographic images on the left, one of Acconci crouched naked on the floor biting his thigh, and the other of a close-up of a bite mark dripping saliva. On the right-hand side, impressions of Acconci's thumb, hand, and forearm with bite marks are inserted into his handwritten text explaining the premise of the piece, which reads in part, biting as much of my body as I can reach, turning on myself, turning in on myself, performance as locomotion across a body, connecting a region, absorption by one organization of a neighboring organization, self-absorption. While the Trademarks print was based on a version of this piece done earlier in New York in 1970, Acconci's Kiss Off was an original production for the litho. I think when I put those slides in, I was going by the color bar markers at the bottom. I apologize. While the Trademarks one was based on an earlier work, the Kiss Off was an original production for the Litho Workshop and clearly seems to have been made in direct response to Wieland's O Canada from a year earlier. But where Wieland had applied her speaking lips to the stone in a conspicuous reference to her feminine authorship, Acconci first applied lipstick to feminize his male body and then wiped it off on the lithostone in a process he recounts in his text as, quote, rubbing off my female characteristics, cleaning myself up, end quote. So if Kiss Off signified Acconci's own desire to expunge the abject and alien feminine from within himself, it can perhaps also be read as a symbolic maneuver aimed to resist the new incursion of feminine and feminist authorship that was emerging in the art world at that precise historical moment, and which had been so forcefully embodied in Wieland's O Canada. For some critics and historians like Buchloh, the performative basis of Acconci's prints would preclude their legitimacy as conceptual art. Others, however, like Fraser Ward, have acknowledged the considerable overlap between the categories of conceptual and performance art around 1970. He regards the performance work of artists like Acconci as an explicit challenge to some of the limitations of conceptual art, but one that he says was made from within a broadly conceptual framework. So in other words, he recognizes Acconci as a conceptual artist, but from within the framework of conceptual art is making critiques of its limits. Fraser Ward's rationale is that such work extended conceptual art's analyses of institutional frameworks to an examination of the effects of these relations on subjectivity as socially contingent and constructed. This interpretation of Acconci's work as an investigation of gendered subjectivity accords with that of feminist historian Emilia Jones, who has read it as a self-conscious critique of the dominant codes of masculinity. But while Acconci's prints, which reveal his body as flawed, troubled, and feminized, do support her view of his work as a critique of coherent masculine subjectivity, the fact is that his kiss-off print, which drew upon the parodic feminine motifs of Wieland's O Canada, also constituted a form of gender cleansing. Indeed, even beyond the text for kiss-off, there is further evidence of Acconci's overt hostility to the possible legitimacy of a specifically feminist inquiry into subjectivity in art practice. This became clear in Acconci's encounter during his trip to Halifax with the work of Martha Wilson. Wilson came to Halifax in 1969 to do graduate work in English literature at Dalhousie University, while her partner, Richard Stardens, enrolled in the MFA program at NSCAD. After being hired to teach grammar at NSCAD, Wilson soon began making conceptual art that paired textual propositions with photographic documents of performative transformations of gendered subjectivity, such as the work on the right, which is entitled Posturing Drag, in which she dresses as a man dressing as a woman, and on the left, Captivating a Man, where she's posed in a kind of direct reference to the images by Man Ray of Marcel Duchamp as his female alter ego, Rose C'est la Vie. And these are both from 1972. Although Lucy Lepard would later acclaim Wilson's work in her groundbreaking 1976 book on feminist art called From the Center, Wilson recalls that when she met Acconci at NSCAD and asked him to critique her work, he dismissed it disparagingly as self-indulgent and irrelevant. This denigration of women artists at the time was, of course, hardly particular to NSCAD. It is not a proud part of its history, however, and revisionist efforts have been made to gloss over its harsh reality. Gary Kennedy, for example, has recently written that the stinging rebuke sent by telegram from Lucy Lepard in 1969 for not including any women in the Halifax conference was a wake-up call that led to greater participation by women at the college. While some improvements in the representation of women were made in the 1970s, by the time the litho workshop closed in 1976, only 6, that is 8.2%, of its 74 participants had been women, and by the late 70s, only 2 women were on the permanent studio faculty. The real impetus for change came from the circulation of an unpublished paper written in 1976 by the MFA student Barbara England, titled An Examination of Masculinism at NSCAD. This paper galvanized students to demand change, one of which led to the hiring of Martha Rossler as a visiting artist and teacher who supplied a vigorous feminist critique of both art and its institutions. She was a scourge, really. Rossler's legacy, along with the hiring of several permanent female faculty members in the 1980s, such as Jan Peacock, Susan McEachran, Wilma Needham, created a vibrant feminist culture at NSCAD that survives into the present. These changes at NSCAD coincided with an important turning point in the mid-70s, when the focus of conceptual art shifted from self-reflexive aesthetic critique to more politically grounded critiques of larger social issues. Ironically, however, this is also often regarded as a period of decline or detumescence after NSCAD's so-called conceptual glory days of the late 60s and early 70s. To be sure, the artistic and pedagogical activities that shaped the radical transformation of NSCAD at that time made vital contributions to local, national, and international art practice. Those contributions were largely dependent upon both the aesthetic innovations and marketing successes of the litho workshop. The workshop succeeded because the political circumstances in the US at the time made Canada an attractive place for American artists to visit and produce work that could then be sold in the lucrative American market. While this remarkable period of activity was profoundly shaped by the cataclysmic events of 1968, the politics of war, race, class, gender, and national identity were only occasionally alluded to in the litho workshop prints. In turn, the self-reflexive critiques initiated by conceptual art became the basis for new modes of cultural critiques that developed in the last quarter of the 20th century into the radical Tendenzkunst, still with us today. As the alphabetical bookends bracketing its roster of artists, Acconci, with his masculine American aggressiveness, and Wieland, with her feminist, parodic Canadian nationalism, seemed to encompass a key manifestation of how these larger international tensions and transitions were played out on the local and microcosmic level of the NSCAD litho workshop. Thank you very much. Well, Peter could supply you with more of the details of what remains, but there were, in most print editions, there were 50, and 4 are, in theory, held at NSCAD, although they were at the AGNS, as the NSCAD edition, although I think there's at least one of those that is down from 4 to 3, right? And then the ones you see up and around the school are all dead impressions. They're worthless. Like they have no value on the market. Nothing like it would have existed when Joyce Wieland was there, and which was 1970. And when Martha Wilson was there, and she was there from 69. I think she left in 73 maybe, but she's back in New York by 70, or in New York by 74, where she became the director of Franklin Furnace. From her descriptions of it to me, I mean, there was absolutely no feminist consciousness at NSCAD whatsoever. And she was stunned when Lucy Lepard showed up and basically said, because Martha Wilson, first of all, she was not an artist. She came from an English background. She came to Halifax and was working on her PhD in literature, and then gave that up for a variety of reasons and started, this idea that you can make art about words using language is kind of a revelation. So that's how she started messing around, and then started using photography and video and so on. Her boyfriend was an artist at the time, but from the way she describes it, I mean, there was no discussion at all, no recognition that what she was doing was even art, let alone whether it was good or bad. And she was told things by certain individuals, such as, well, serious art is only made in black and white. She was making color photography, and women don't make it anyway. And so she had no audience or no community for discussion. And then Lucy Lepard showed up and said to her that there were women all over North America that were doing work that was similar to this. And this is Martha Wilson's, version of the story, but that at the time, until she encountered Lucy Lepard, she was literally working in a kind of vacuum. And so that changed. But when Martha Rossler started coming toward the end of the 70s, very late 70s, I don't know that a feminist collective formally existed at the time, but things had begun to change. Vivian Cameron had come. She was an art historian who taught a course on women artists. And so things had certainly begun to change. And I don't know that Martha Rosser had a direct involvement or not in the feminist collective, but she definitely was an irritant to all, you know, to many, many members of the young old boys who ran the school. And the difference was, I think, that Mira Shore and perhaps to a lesser extent Vivian Cameron, the difference with Martha Rosser was her take no prisoners approach, and she would not be intimidated. And I think Mira Shore was fairly easily intimidated. And also she made a kind of very feminist art. It was very beautiful, very delicate, works on paper. They were about dress, easily dismissed. Whereas Martha Rosser's work was really quite brutal by comparison. And as she describes it, when she showed her work, the Bowery, the full title, the inadequate descriptive systems, she was showing these black and white photographs of evidence of alcohol and these bombed out doorways in the Bowery. And Benjamin Buchloh apparently was in the audience at the time, and at the end of her presentation said, "Those are the ugliest photographs I've ever seen. Can we publish them?" That's the apocryphal story, or the anecdotal story, so I don't know. But I do think that Martha Rosser, I think more than anybody else, was really responsible for generating that kind of anger among the students. And that paper by Barbara England, which still floats around at the school. Although I suppose the difference is that painting and drawing and so on were art forms that were being repressed because they were being subverted because they were the legacy of modernism, so they had to be undone. Whereas feminism it wasn't something that had to be challenged because it was non-existent. It was something completely new. So while both were repressed, I think the purposes and the reasons were different. One was a complete inability to even, I mean, it was a blind spot, a complete blind spot. The other was a willful denigration, I think. I mean, they're both willful denigrations, but one was predicated on a blindness, and the other was a deliberate subversion, I think, of that history. And, yeah, and in Halifax, of course, it was the New York conceptual art connection, that link. I mean, and that was quite a specific kind of conceptual art that was practiced in New York that was different than what was going on in Europe and Latin America and so on. So the Halifax New York connection was a much more kind of rigid, or not rigid, but it was a very severe kind of pared down, linguistically based version of it. But Charlotte Townsend Galt said another interesting thing to me at one time. I don't know if you remember this, but we were talking a year or two ago, and she said that another thing about this climate was that because Charlotte Townsend Galt was the director of the Mezzanine Gallery, she was the one that the letter from Baldessari had been addressed to. She's now out in Vancouver. But she said that at the time, she felt that, it was her feeling anyway, that much of the activity that went on at NSCAD was really not for the students at all. That it was for visiting artists that came there, for certain faculty members who were there, to communicate with their peers in that global reach. But that the students were part of it, and certainly very, very actively participating, but often what went on was so beyond them, and that it was so confusing that I'm not sure that they all often fully grasped what was going on. And I think that she maybe implied that this perhaps might have been more the case for local students who hadn't come from bigger cities where they might have heard of conceptual art before, and so on. That's her impression. I'm not sure about that yet, but this was an impression that she had at the time. I did have one student who ended up a few years ago in my 20th century survey class, and I did my lecture on conceptual art. Well, you know, it's part of a whole survey of the 20th century, so we get to the lecture on conceptual art. And she put up her hand. She was an older woman, like my age, even a little bit older than me. She put up her hand and she said, you know, I was a student then. And I think I was talking about David Askeveld's projects class, in which artists mailed in projects that he would then execute with the students in the class. She said, I was a student in that class. She said, I had no idea what was going on. I didn't know what anybody was talking about, ever. She said, finally now I get it. But she herself, you know, she'd come back years later, I guess, to finish her degree, but at the time she was just like in a fog the whole time. And, you know, nobody, I mean, it was like if she could get it, then fine, but somebody like Lawrence Weiner, who taught at the school at the time, he would never condescend to explain and he would regard that as condescending, to explain what was going on. If you didn't get it, you didn't deserve to get it. It's sort of, I think. I guess I would say that I do think there's a legacy, although I think there's two aspects of that. And one is that I think that the overall legacy of conceptual art is what I was alluding to at the end of my paper, which is that while conceptual art during its, you know, formative years was very inner focused on debates within the art world, I think that the process of critically examining art and its systems and so on did have an impact that we still experience the legacy of over 25 years, which is to begin then to move more outwardly and to apply that critical perspective to the question about the relationship between art and that larger social world. So, and that, you know, brings me back to that question about, you know, feminist art and conceptual art and how both of them, I think, to a certain extent, contribute to that legacy. So that's one aspect of it. And you don't necessarily see that in conceptual practices, but more in an attitude. And on the other hand, I think that there are many, I think conceptual art as a form of practice has continued to be evident. And I think one thing that we really see today, though, in the work of a lot of younger artists is a kind of mining of the legacy of conceptual art. Although I think in many cases, and this is something I want to explore more in my current research, in many of these cases, it seems that it's a very formal aesthetic kind of mining of the legacy of conceptual art. And the criticality is often absent, and it's a kind of playing with the forms and with the framework, with the constructs and so on. You know, the archive and the linguistic premises and those sorts of things. So I think there's definitely, and that's, I don't know, Shauna, I think maybe that's something that you were alluding to me earlier, something you were looking into, so you might want to add to that. But just before, and which I would like you to do, but in terms of pedagogy, I think that this continues to exist. Certainly the role of conceptual art is still evident at a school like NSCAD in terms of the criticality that's expected and that's fostered. But you can still do painting and drawing and craft, and is definitely resurgent there. So the emphasis on skill and on tacit knowledge and so on, which conceptual art just totally threw away, is very much embraced. So it's more, it survives at a kind of intellectual, a level of intellectual engagement, if it does at all. So I think it's there, but diminishing, perhaps.